the Pope who knew the end was coming. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican, behind doors sealed with wax that bears the mark of the fisherman's ring, there exists a prophecy so terrifying that only 3 souls in history have dared to read it in its entirety. I am Father Graves, keeper of shadows, guardian of truths that burn like acid through the soul. Tonight, I break my vow of silence to reveal the story of Pope Pius XIII, the pontiff who discovered that the end of days was not a distant biblical promise, but a countdown already begun. A man who found himself torn between saving humanity and preserving the very institution that held the key to our destruction. What he uncovered in the secret archives changed him forever, and what he chose to do with that knowledge may have sealed all our fates. Subscribe now to accompany each dark mystery that I reveal from the depths of the Vatican. The rain fell like tears of the damned on that October evening in 1978, each drop carrying with it the weight of centuries-old secrets. I remember because I was there, a young priest then assigned to the night watch of the Apostolic Palace. Cardinal Giuseppe Albani had just been elected Pope, taking the name Pius XIII, though few would remember him by that title for long. History has a way of erasing those who threaten its carefully constructed narratives. Pope Pius XIII was not like his predecessors. While others sought comfort in tradition and ceremony, he possessed an insatiable hunger for truth that would prove to be both his greatest virtue and his ultimate downfall. On his 3rd night as pontiff, unable to sleep under the weight of his new responsibilities, he made a decision that would change the course of human history. He descended alone into the secret archives, that labyrinthine repository of 2,000 years of Christianity's most guarded secrets. The archives stretch for miles beneath Vatican City, their corridors lined with documents that chronicle not just the glory of the Church, but its darkest hours. Treaties with demons, records of failed exorcisms, correspondence with beings that should not exist. Most popes never venture beyond the public sections, content to let sleeping devils lie. But Pius XIII was different. He carried with him that night a key that had been passed down through an unbroken chain of papal secretaries, a key to the Hereticus Maximus, the vault of ultimate heresy. What he found there, in a chamber barely large enough to hold a single reading desk and 1 wooden chair, was a manuscript bound in leather so old it crumbled at his touch. The text was written in 3 languages, Latin, Ancient Greek, and something far older, something that predated human civilization. It was called the Prophetia Ultima, the final prophecy, and according to the accompanying documents, it had been dictated to Pope Sylvester I in the year 335 by a being of immense power and terrible beauty. The prophecy spoke of 7 seals that bound the forces of chaos, 7 guardians whose deaths would herald the beginning of the end. But more terrifying still, it provided a timeline. Not the vague end times of Revelation, but specific dates, specific signs, specific names. And according to the calculations scrawled in the margins by previous readers, the 7th seal was to be broken not in some distant future, but within the next 6 months. Pope Pius XIII spent 17 hours in that chamber, emerging only when the Swiss Guard finally discovered his absence and came searching. They found him changed, aged decades in a single night, his hair now streaked with white, his eyes haunted by visions no mortal should witness. From that moment forward, he became a man obsessed, spending every waking hour trying to understand what he had read and, more importantly, what he could do to stop it. The prophecy identified the 7 seals not as mystical concepts, but as specific individuals scattered across the globe. 7 people whose deaths, in a particular order and under specific circumstances, would weaken the barriers between our world and the realm of absolute chaos. The first seal had been broken in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an event that the prophecy claimed was orchestrated not by Serbian nationalists, but by forces far more sinister. The second seal fell in 1945 with the death of Franklin Roosevelt, whose passing opened the door to the nuclear age and humanity's first real glimpse of its own potential for self-destruction. By 1978, according to Pius XIII's frantic calculations, 5 seals had already been broken. The death of Gandhi in 1948, John Kennedy in 1963, and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Each death had been orchestrated to occur at specific astrological moments, in specific locations, under circumstances that maximized their spiritual impact. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for, and it pointed to an intelligence that had been playing a game of cosmic chess for over 60 years. The 6th seal, the prophecy revealed, would be broken with the death of a spiritual leader beloved by millions, a man whose passing would plunge the faithful into despair and doubt. Pope Pius XIII realized with growing horror that the description matched perfectly with his predecessor, John Paul I, whose sudden death after only 33 days in office had shocked the world. The timing was perfect, the circumstances mysterious enough to fuel decades of conspiracy theories, and the spiritual impact undeniable. This meant that only one seal remained, and according to the prophecy, its breaking was already in motion. The seventh guardian was described as the shepherd who tends the flock in the shadow of St. Peter, a pontiff who would die not from natural causes or human malice, but from the weight of truth itself. Pope Pius XIII understood with crystalline clarity that he was looking at his own death warrant. But the prophecy contained one final, devastating revelation. The seventh seal could only be broken if the guardian died in ignorance of his role. If the final pope understood what was happening, if he faced his death with full knowledge of its consequences, the seal would not break, but it would not remain intact either. Instead, it would transfer to another, beginning a cycle that could continue indefinitely until someone was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. The choice before Pope Pius XIII was terrible in its simplicity. He could remain silent, accept his fate, and allow the end of the world to proceed as prophesied. Or he could fight back, knowing that his resistance would only postpone the inevitable while condemning countless others to carry the burden he was meant to bear. What followed were the most bizarre and terrifying 4 months in Vatican history. Pope Pius XIII began implementing changes that seemed random to outside observers but were actually part of a desperate plan to break the cycle. He started by purging the Vatican of anyone he suspected might be connected to the forces behind the prophecy. Cardinal Turretti, who had served faithfully for 30 years, was suddenly dismissed and sent to a monastery in Tibet. Monsignor Castellane, the papal secretary, disappeared entirely, though officially he had requested a transfer to missionary work in the Amazon. The Pope began conducting private meetings with individuals whose identities were kept absolutely secret. They arrived at the Vatican under cover of darkness, usually through the ancient tunnels that connected the Holy See to various locations throughout Rome. Some were scholars of ancient languages, others were survivors of encounters with entities that science refused to acknowledge. All of them left those meetings pale and shaken, as if they had stared into an abyss that stared back. Meanwhile, strange accidents began occurring throughout the Vatican. Crosses would invert themselves overnight, only to return to their proper position by morning. Sacred relics would go missing, only to be found days later in impossible locations, like inside sealed walls or at the bottom of fountains that had been drained years earlier. The temperature in certain chambers would drop without explanation, and staff members reported hearing whispers in languages that had been dead for millennia. Pope Pius XIII's own behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning with dirt under his fingernails and ancient symbols carved into his palms. He stopped celebrating public masses, claiming that he was no longer worthy to perform the Eucharist. When pressed by concerned cardinals, he would only say that he was preparing for a war that began before Christ walked among us. The truth, which I learned only years later when I was granted access to his private journals, was that Pope Pius XIII had discovered something even more disturbing than the prophecy itself. The forces behind the seven seals were not external entities seeking to destroy humanity, but humanity's own collective unconscious, driven to self-destruction by millennia of accumulated guilt and shame. The seals were not barriers keeping evil out, but barriers keeping humanity's darkest impulses contained. Each of the seven guardians had been individuals who represented hope, progress, and the better angels of human nature. Their deaths, timed and orchestrated with mathematical precision, had been designed not to summon demons from hell, but to release the demons that humanity had created within itself. The end of the world would come not through fire and brimstone, but through a complete moral collapse that would make the 20th century's horrors look like a preview of coming attractions. This revelation led Pope Pius XIII to a conclusion that would have been branded heretical by his own church. The only way to break the cycle was not to prevent his own death, but to die in such a way that his sacrifice would serve as a counter-ritual, a spiritual shock that would force humanity to confront its own darkness before it was too late. He had to die publicly, dramatically, and in a manner that would make it impossible for the forces behind the prophecy to use his death for their own purposes. On February 14, 1979, Pope Pius XIII requested a private audience with the entire College of Cardinals. What happened in that meeting has never been officially recorded, but those who were present described it as the most terrifying experience of their lives. The Pope, they said, spoke for 3 hours without pause, his voice growing stronger and more commanding as he revealed secret after secret, conspiracy after conspiracy, truth after devastating truth about the Church's hidden history. He told them about the Borgias pacts with entities that fed on human suffering. He revealed the true purpose behind the Crusades, which had been designed not to reclaim the Holy Land, but to conduct massive blood rituals under the guise of holy war. He exposed the real reason behind the Church's persecution of scientists like Galileo, not because they challenged religious doctrine, but because they threatened to discover the cosmic mechanism that the Church had been using to maintain its power for over 1,000 years. But most devastating of all, he revealed that every pope since Innocent III had been aware of the prophecy and had actively participated in ensuring its fulfillment, believing that the end of the world would result in their own elevation to godhood. Pope Pius XIII had broken a chain of corruption and conspiracy that stretched back nearly 8 centuries. The Cardinals' reaction was swift and unanimous. Pope Pius XIII was declared mentally incompetent and placed under house arrest in his papal apartments. Officially, he was suffering from exhaustion and would recover shortly. Unofficially, they began making preparations for a papal funeral. But Pius XIII had anticipated this response and had already set his final plan in motion. 4 months, he had been secretly meeting with journalists, politicians, and religious leaders from around the world, sharing with them pieces of what he had learned. He had created a dead man's switch, a network of individuals who would release specific information if he died under mysterious circumstances. More importantly, he had found a way to use the prophecy against itself. The ritual that would break the 7th seal required his death to occur in a state of despair and spiritual isolation. But if he could arrange to die while performing an act of ultimate spiritual significance, surrounded by witnesses who understood the true nature of his sacrifice, the energy that was meant to break the final seal could be redirected into strengthening it permanently. On March 6, 1979, Pope Pius XIII announced that he would be celebrating a special Mass in St. Peter's Square, open to the public and broadcast worldwide. The Vatican tried to cancel the event, but he had already sent invitations directly to major news organizations, and the story had become too public to suppress without raising suspicions. That morning, as nearly 100,000 people gathered in St. Peter's Square and millions more watched on television, Pope Pius XIII emerged from the Apostolic Palace looking like a man who had stared into the face of eternity and found peace. He was dressed not in the traditional papal vestments, but in the simple brown robes of a Franciscan monk, carrying only a wooden crucifix that had supposedly belonged to St. Francis himself. The Mass he celebrated that day was unlike anything in the Church's history. Instead of following the traditional liturgy, he spoke directly to the crowd, his words carried by loudspeakers and broadcast signals to every corner of the globe. He talked about redemption not through divine grace, but through human choice. He spoke of evil not as an external force, but as the abdication of moral responsibility. And he revealed, though in language so coded that only those who had been prepared understood its true meaning, the existence of the prophecy and his own role as the 7th seal. Then, as he raised the communion host above his head in the traditional gesture of consecration, something extraordinary happened. The sky, which had been clear and blue moments before, suddenly filled with dark clouds that seemed to spiral inward toward the Vatican. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and many in the crowd reported hearing a sound like distant thunder, though no lightning was visible. Pope Pius XIII collapsed at that moment, not from a heart attack or stroke as the medical reports would later claim, but from what witnesses described as a visible draining of his life force, as if the very essence of his being was being drawn upward into the swirling darkness above. His last words, heard clearly by those closest to the altar and confirmed by multiple recording devices, were, "It is finished, but it is also begun." He died with a smile on his face, his hand still clutching the wooden crucifix, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. The clouds dispersed immediately after his death, and the temperature returned to normal, but the spiritual impact of what had just occurred rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. In the days and weeks that followed, something unprecedented began happening around the world. People who had witnessed the Mass either in person or on television, started reporting profound spiritual experiences. Not religious conversion in the traditional sense, but a sudden, overwhelming awareness of their own moral choices and their consequences for others. Crime rates plummeted in major cities. International conflicts that had seemed intractable suddenly found peaceful resolutions. Environmental movements gained momentum as if powered by an invisible engine. The effect was temporary, lasting only about 6 months, but it was enough to break the cycle that had been building for over 60 years. The 7th seal did not break with Pope Pius XIII's death because his sacrifice had transformed what should have been a moment of despair into a moment of hope. The forces that had been orchestrating humanity's destruction found their carefully laid plans disrupted by an act of selfless courage that they had not anticipated. But the story does not end with Pius XIII's noble sacrifice, for the truth about the Vatican's dark mysteries is never quite so simple. 3 weeks after the Pope's funeral, while cleaning out his private chambers, a maintenance worker discovered something that chilled the blood of everyone who learned about it. Hidden behind a false wall in the papal library was a second manuscript, this one written entirely in Pius XIII's own hand. In this journal, the late Pope revealed that the prophecy he had found in the secret archives was not the original document dictated to Pope Sylvester I, but a forgery created in the 14th century by a cabal of cardinals who sought to overthrow the papal hierarchy and establish their own rule over the Church. The real prophecy, which he had found buried beneath centuries of deliberate misdirection, told a completely different story. According to the authentic Prophetia Ultima, the 7 seals were not barriers holding back chaos, but locks preventing the return of an ancient benevolent force that had been banished from earth by those who profited from human suffering. The deaths of the 7 guardians were not meant to bring about the end of the world, but to herald its spiritual transformation, the return of an age when humanity would live in harmony with forces beyond their understanding. The cardinals who had created the false prophecy had done so to ensure that any pope who discovered the truth would react with fear rather than hope, would seek to prevent the transformation rather than facilitate it. For over 6 centuries, they and their successors had been working to maintain humanity in a state of spiritual immaturity, feeding off the negative energy generated by war, hatred, and despair. Pope Pius XIII had realized this deception only in his final weeks, but by then it was too late to change his plan. His death, designed to strengthen what he thought were barriers against chaos, had actually accelerated the process he was trying to stop. The 6 months of global spiritual awakening that followed his sacrifice were not a temporary reprieve, but the first stage of humanity's transformation into something greater than it had ever been. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the journal's final entry, written just hours before his public mass. In it, Pope Pius XIII revealed that he had made peace with being manipulated because he had come to understand that the true test facing humanity was not whether they could prevent the end of the world, but whether they could choose to evolve beyond their current limitations even when given the opportunity to remain safely ignorant. The forces orchestrating the 7 seals, he wrote, were neither good nor evil in any human sense, but representatives of a cosmic intelligence that was simply waiting for humanity to mature enough to rejoin the community of truly conscious beings. The suffering, the manipulation, the centuries of carefully orchestrated crisis, were all part of a graduation exam that humanity had to pass not through divine intervention, but through the exercise of collective free will. His sacrifice, therefore, had been successful not because it prevented disaster, but because it demonstrated that humans could choose the greater good even when faced with their own destruction. The brief period of global awakening that followed his death was proof that the test had been passed, that humanity was ready for whatever came next. But here, in the shadows of St. Peter's Basilica, as I prepare to close this account and return these forbidden documents to their resting place, I am haunted by one final question. If Pope Pius XIII was right, if his death was merely the completion of a cosmic examination that humanity passed with flying colors, then why do I still feel the weight of invisible eyes watching from the darkness? Why do the ancient symbols carved into the deepest foundations of the Vatican still pulse with a life of their own when no one else is looking? Perhaps the truth is that graduation from one level of existence simply means enrollment in the next, more challenging course. Perhaps the forces that tested humanity's moral development are now observing our spiritual evolution, waiting to see if we can handle the responsibilities that come with true cosmic citizenship. Or perhaps Pope Pius XIII, for all his intelligence and nobility, was himself being tested, and his journal entries were simply another layer of the deception he thought he had uncovered. I have spent decades studying the documents he left behind, cross-referencing them with other sources in the secret archives, and I have reached a conclusion that fills me with both hope and terror. The prophecy, in whatever form it truly takes, is not finished. Pope Pius XIII was not the 7th seal, but the first of a new series, a new test designed for a humanity that has demonstrated its capacity for moral choice but has yet to prove its ability to handle the power that comes with true spiritual awakening. The changes that began with his death have continued, but they have been subtle, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary events. Wars still occur, but they end more quickly and with less devastation than before. Natural disasters still strike, but communities recover faster and stronger than anyone expects. Scientific discoveries that should take decades are happening in years, and artistic achievements that should be once-in-a-century occurrences are becoming commonplace. Humanity is evolving, but evolution is never without its dangers. The same spiritual awakening that has made us more compassionate has also made us more powerful. and power without wisdom is perhaps the greatest threat the universe can face. Somewhere in the cosmic hierarchy, entities far beyond our comprehension are watching to see what we do with these new abilities, and their judgment will determine not just our future, but the future of countless other worlds that exist in the vast expanse of creation. The Vatican knows this, has always known this, which is why its deepest vaults contain not just records of our past, but preparations for our future. The Church has been training ground disguised as a religion, a testing facility masquerading as a spiritual sanctuary. Every prayer, every ritual, every act of faith has been both genuine worship and subtle examination, measuring humanity's readiness for truths that would drive most minds to madness. And now, as I place these documents back in their lead-line case and seal it with wax that contains compounds unknown to modern science, I am reminded that my role as keeper of these secrets is itself part of a larger pattern. I am not just preserving dangerous knowledge for future generations, but serving as a guardian in the ongoing test that humanity continues to face. The story of Pope Pius XIII, the pontiff who knew the end was coming, is not a tale of one man's heroic sacrifice to save the world. It is the chronicle of humanity's first steps toward a destiny so magnificent and terrifying that our ancestors could only describe it in the language of apocalypse. The end that he saw approaching was not the destruction of our world, but the destruction of our limitations, the death of our spiritual childhood, and the birth of something unprecedented in the history of the cosmos. Whether that transformation leads to transcendence or catastrophe remains to be seen. But as I walk through these ancient corridors, past tombs of popes who carried similar secrets to their graves, I am certain of one thing. The test continues, the watchers still observe, and the choices we make in the coming decades will echo through eternity. The Vatican's darkest mysteries are not about the past, but about the future we are only beginning to create. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying mystery of all. If you found yourself drawn into this shadowy mystery, subscribe now to this channel for more secrets that Father Graves dares to reveal from the depths of the Vatican's forbidden archives. Comment below, what is the most frightening secret you believe the Vatican still guards? Share your theory so we can investigate it in the next video.